Alright guys, this is part 2 of the 2013-14 Connorland WHAP review, and we're picking up where we left off with political control and features of classical era civilizations. Now the first thing we're going to look at before we get to them individually is what were the characteristics of all of them. In other words, what was similar about all of these places that we're going to be dealing with during this period. And it's pretty basic, man. You've got some kind of political hierarchy, and the king is not really in control of everything on a day-to-day basis. He has people under him. So if you look right here, towards the arrows, it's kind of how it goes from top to bottom. You've got the kings at the top, obviously, along with emperors, depending on what kind of a title they decide to use. Under them, you have some kind of vice king or some kind of, assistant, I guess is the best way to put it, that runs, kind of the day-to-day operations for the king or emperor. Then you have governors who are in charge of different regions within the empire, and then under them you have city leaders who ran each individual city, kind of like mayors like we have today. So be aware that there was a top to bottom hierarchy when it came to government during this period in these empires. Also, there were tons of other people involved of a key word in world history, which is bureaucracy. And some of the jobs in which people did within this government bureaucracy were record keepers to figure out what they had on hand as far as crops, supplies, weapons, whatever it is. All right, they're the ones in charge of counting stuff. Then you have tax collectors who would go out and collect the taxes on a yearly basis or whenever they decided to do it, and then soldiers, judges, etc. So the government wasn't run by one person. Yes, there may have been one person in charge, but there were tons of people in this bureaucracy that really made these empires keep rolling as they went. First on our list of empires is the Persian Empire, which we've talked about already as far as the location, but more or less located from the modern day country of Turkey, 2 points leading east. So going back from there, a little bit of northern Africa as well, but centered or controlled in Turkey and the modern day country of Iran. I guess Iran's the most important. I don't know why I said that. But some of the features of it, number one is satraps. These were the guys who were the eyes and ears of the king. They were the ones who were out on the ground in all of these different cities or regions and would kind of give him a heads up on what was going on, where if a rebellion was beginning to form, if a military was coming in, if taxes were down, whatever it was just people who kept giving him, who would give him updates on what was going on in his empire. Next is the Royal Road, which I think you can see marked out in this map. I know it's kind of hard to see, but this was the world's first highway system, and the fact that they used it to get messages back and forth from the satraps, or to move the army, or to move goods, or whatever it was. Basically the same things we use highways for today. It's just the first one in history. As this place goes on, you don't have to know a ton of stuff about each of these empires, but the fall of them are pretty important, and they begin to fall because of overextension. And you'll see that as a common theme as we go throughout these empires, that they just get too big to manage, and when they do, it leaves a power vacuum. It leaves it open for invaders to come in and take them over, or to weaken them to the point where they fall. And in the case of the Persian Empire, it was Alexander the Great from Macedonia or northern Greece who comes in towards the end and more or less finishes them off. Next on our list are the East Asian or Chinese dynasties during this period, particularly the Qin and the Han. Now, before we get to the differences or characteristics between these two, we need to look at the similarities and the legacies that they leave for empires, Chinese empires that come after them. And I apologize, I've got to look at my notes because it's a lot of stuff. But some of the commonalities they have are religious toleration, technological achievements, and in the governmental system, particularly with the emperor. And these things last for thousands of years. Now, getting to kind of the characteristics of each, the Qin Dynasty and what you need to tie into it, this is where the mandate of heaven comes in. And the mandate of heaven is nothing more than the ruler's right to rule. In other words, they believe that the gods, or whatever you want to call it, have blessed this man to be able to rule the country. So, basically the way it boils down, if things are going good, if the economy's rolling, if people are generally happy, if they're not threatened by outside invaders, the emperor is seen to be pleasing the gods and has kept the mandate of heaven. But on the flip side of that, if things start going bad, if the economy goes south, if peasants are going hungry, if there's a famine or a natural disaster or anything like that, or if there's a threat from barbarians or invaders, it's seen that the emperor is not doing something right and he has lost the mandate of heaven, and that gives someone justification to come in and overthrow them. And you see that over and over and over throughout Chinese history. It's what the Han claim when they go in and overthrow the Qin. There is a period of, kind of civil war there, but eventually they use it as a justification to take over power. Another thing with the Qin is legalism, which is another political philosophy that's kind of in the same category or era as Confucianism and Taoism. And basically what legalism does is it claims that people are born evil, and to keep them in line, you need to have harsh punishments for any transgressions or any crimes that they commit. So Bottom line, if you do something wrong, you're going to get punished overly harsh for it, and that's what you need to tie into this philosophy. It's also the foundations for the dynastic rule and the dynastic cycle, which we'll look at a little bit in class. But mandate of heaven, legalism, and the dynastic rule are the foundations of it. Moving forward to the Han, now you'll see them a lot of times in comparison to Rome because they were contemporaries of them. They were around about the same time, or they were at the height of their powers at the same time. They traded with the Roman Empire. Now, granted, it's a long distance trade over the Silk Road, but there was some connection, there was some interaction between the two, even though someone from Rome may not have went to the capital of the Han or vice versa. They got their power through a combination of things that are a similarity between a lot of these empires: diplomacy, trade, and the military. So you've got diplomacy, you've got force, and you've also got economic ways to get and to keep your power. Now, the Han are also known for two major building projects that, though they're not finished in this era, are begun. They're the Great Wall and the Grand Canal. And the reasons for each: first of all, the Great Wall was built to keep out northern invaders. All right, very simply, to keep people out. The Grand Canal was to move people from one place to another, to link northern and southern China. And the reason they wanted to do that was to create a common, I guess you could call it a Han culture, in the fact that people would be migrating back and forth, and also to move products back and forth, particularly food, because one part of China is more suited for wheat growing than the other. Wheat and rice are their two main crops. So to be able to get those products from one region to another, they began the Grand Canal. Next on our list of classical empires, we move over to South Asia, and I'll be honest with you guys, there's not a lot of stuff you need to know about the Mauryan or the Gupta, just more or less where they're at, and also be able to tie Ashoka into the Mauryan Empire. And the key characteristic, the main thing about Ashoka, is that he converted to Buddhism during the course of his rule and really began to spread the religion throughout India, or to popularize it, I guess would be a better way to put it. With the Guptas, really the I don't know, I guess you call it the innovations in what we would now call education, like the concept of zero, Arabic numerals, things that tie into mathematics and things like that. Moving westward over to the Mediterranean region with the three classical empires that were located here at different times, you've got Phoenicia, the Greek city-states, and Rome. And it's almost impossible to see on this map, but once again, Phoenicia located more or less here in what we now call the Middle East, or in Israel. The Greek city-states, obviously located in the current-day country of Greece, and Rome in the current-day country of Italy. As far as their characteristics, with Phoenicia, the big thing is their legacy. All right, they did create an alphabet, they did have colonies, and they did trade luxury goods. Particularly their purple dye is what they were best known for. But more importantly, for our purposes, the legacy that they left behind, and the things that Greece picked up from them, like the alphabet, like their coinage system and things, influenced the Greek city-states as they got going, and in turn, the Greek city-states influenced Rome. So there is a link from Phoenicia to Rome, and you need to be able to draw that. As far as the features of the Greek city-states, look, democracy is the main one, with their government system and things like that. It wouldn't be a bad idea to know about the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens. Let's see, I'm trying to think of things off the top of my head. Alexander the Great, obviously, with the spread of Greek culture through a process called Hellenism, which we'll talk about in class, plays in as well. And just the basics of it, you should be okay. As far as Rome, a lot of it centers around technology for our purposes. We're talking about things like aqueducts, their road system, their architecture, the fact that they used concrete where people hadn't before, and things like that. Also, their military, and the fact that it was one of the best in the world at this time, and it was used primarily when it wasn't out expanding, when they weren't spreading, quote unquote, the Roman way, was used to protect trade routes in which they got products from one part of the empire to the other. And Rome was a huge empire in its day, along with Alexander the Great's. Speaking of the Roman way, it was a way that they brought people into the empire. Like, people didn't necessarily want to be conquered, but once they were quick to adapt Roman ways. In other words, the dress of the Roman people, the language that they spoke, the way that they built their buildings, and other things. It was a way for Rome to assimilate people into their empire in the easiest way possible. Next on the journey, we settle on over to the Western Hemisphere in Mesoamerica with the Maya and the Teotihuacan. Know the basics of it, what you see here. All right, the Mayan writing system was the only writing system at this time in the Western Hemisphere. Also, terrace farming was the way in which they took land that was not necessarily suitable for agriculture and made it suitable for agriculture. I'll explain how that works in class, and we've looked at it before. but be able to tie this in with the Maya. As far as Teotihuacan, it was not an empire itself. It was a city-state. All right. So kind of like Athens, kind of like Sparta, just a city in the surrounding area. They did trade with the Mayans. They also it was one of the largest cities in the world, and things like that. And they were also known for their trade goods, I guess you could call it their craftsmanship. Last on our list, we'll go to Andean South America with the Moche, who were the two characteristics you need to know. One, they had a class in their civilization that consisted of warrior priests. They were both religious leaders and warriors, and also they did terracing as well, and signaling kind of what's going to come down the line with the Aztecs. There is evidence of them performing human sacrifice as part of their religious rituals. Moving on to the common features of these classical civilizations, the first one is cities. All right, now a city back then is no different than a city now. It's just on a much smaller scale in a lot of cases, and the function that they serve is exactly the same. They're economic hubs, they're economic centers, or where a lot of the business in a state, country, empire, whatever it is, takes place. They're also the seats of government, in some cases capitals. Also, they're the center of culture. It's where a lot of culture, be it the arts, music, and I'm talking more particularly today, where these things diffuse from throughout the rest of the region, country, whatever. Some of the main ones of this time period, and you need to be able to A, know where they are, or know who they are, and B, where they are on a map. All right, we got Alexandria, Rome, Constantinople, Chang'an, and Teotihuacan. All right, so Alexandria, I don't have a map up, and I apologize, but Alexandria is in North Africa in the modern-day country of Egypt. Rome is obviously in Italy. Constantinople is in the modern-day country of Turkey. Chang'an is in East Asia, and Teotihuacan is in Andean South America. So be able to locate those and know what the function of the function of them were. Next on the list of and remember, this is the similarities of classical civilizations. So the things that were, generally the same throughout all of these places that we've looked at. There is a social structure, there is a social hierarchy, and by and large, they're going to be the same except for one exception. You've got political and religious elites at the top, no matter where you're at during this time period. Then you have merchants everywhere but China. Merchants were not seen as very high on the totem pole, if you will, during this time period because they didn't produce anything with their hands, so they weren't seen as having a high value. Then you have warriors, then you have craftspeople, laborers, and slaves, and this is going to be pretty consistent through this time period in all of these places. Once again, except for the merchant situation in China. You've also, during this period in these classical civilizations, have different forms of labor, and that's going to be one of the themes that we look at throughout each period as we go. In this time period, we're talking basically three groups of people who do all the labor. You've got free people or free agricultural workers, indentured servants, and slaves. Now, a lot of the people doing these jobs still is centering around agriculture, but you're kind of seeing different classifications of them. The main thing during this period that a lot of people had to do outside of their regular job was help on government building projects, like the Grand Canal, like the Great Wall, and things like that. In other words, jobs that are put forth by the government that people have to take time out of their job to go do from occasion to occasion. All right, now this will be the last thing that we cover in this section or in this part of the review, but it's the decline and fall of these classical civilizations. Now, there's a lot of similarities as you go through this, and the process is normally the same no matter where you look at. You've got a combination of internal and external pressures, okay? So in other words, like it says, a long decline in political, social, and economic conditions and pressures from outside, particularly from quote-unquote barbarian invaders. Now, some of these internal pressures that can happen to weaken the empire and make them susceptible to being overrun by invaders are it can be disease, it can be peasant revolts, it can be resistance to taxation, breakdown of authority, and failing economies. In other words, you get a combination of one or more of these things that occur, and it leaves you vulnerable. And it leaves you vulnerable to these external pressures, like I said, the barbarians, like the Huns, the Goths, or the Vandals in Rome. Okay, so all these things combine to make the empires in this era eventually fall. Okay, so that wraps up part 2, guys. We're rolling on along here. Next time we will continue on with period 2.